My name is Jerome Fascione, and I've spent the last 3 decades learning and teaching about African American history. I was raised in a multicultural home where I was taught to seek the truth and work toward justice. You see, it is my belief that through education and the pursuit of truth, we can fix the injustices that exist in the world. I welcome you to Time Out for Black History. Welcome back to another episode of Time Out for Black History. Today I want to do a little segment that I call What We Need is More John Browns. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with John Brown, the historical figure. He was prominent in the 1850s. He was a white abolitionist. And hopefully you understand abolitionist is somebody who was fighting against the institution of slavery. And there were a lot of white abolitionists at the time, but what made him unique was his devotion and his desire to rid the country of the institution of slavery. So he was raised by a Calvinist father who taught him that slavery was an abhorrent institution, that there's no place for it, and he would dedicate his life to the overthrow of the institution of slavery. Now, he's a controversial figure because he used violence as a means to end the institution of slavery. Now, those of you who understand history know that it was violence that got rid of the institution of slavery, that eventually Abraham Lincoln would use the military in order to end that institution in this country. So really, John Brown was just ahead of his time when it came to his belief that only bloodshed would end the institution of slavery. Now, this video isn't to condone violence or ask you to use violence. It's about John Brown's conviction and the fact that he was willing to give everything he had in order to get rid of the institution of slavery. And what makes it really an anomaly is nobody questions why Nat Turner did his slave revolt or Gabriel Prosser, because those were black men who were fighting for their freedom. What made John Brown unique was he was a white man who was willing to give his own life for what he believed was a great cause in the ending of slavery. So he organizes this revolt. Nothing about his physical revolt worked out the way he wanted it to. And eventually he ends up captured, him and his sons. One of his sons dies, and he's put on trial. And at the trial, he both puts the South on trial for the institution of slavery, but also the North. And he calls on the North to do what was right in getting rid of this institution. And he eventually is found guilty of insurrection, and he is sentenced to die. And so he ends up hanging from the gallows, and a few years later, the army's marching into battle against the Confederacy, and they're singing the song John Brown's Body. You know, and he became kind of a hero for what he had sacrificed in this great battle against slavery. But the interesting thing about it is I always ask my students, we do a little thing where I talk about who John Brown was and whether he should be seen as a saint or a sinner, you know, and they get the whole version of his life and his story. And, you know, it's a good question, and the kids usually come up with some really good arguments for why they believe what they believe. But we always do a little exercise where I ask them if their mother or father was being held hostage and they were the only ones who could free them, would they be willing to risk their own life to free them? And the answer is always yes. And I say the same thing about their best friend. And it's about 80-20 yes. And then I say the same thing about a stranger that they don't know. And that number usually drops to around 30. And so that ushers in this major question. Should we do the right thing because it's the right thing? Should it matter who it is that we're doing the right thing for? And so when I said at the beginning of this, what we need is more John Browns, we need more people who are willing to look at the struggles of others and fight and advocate for those. I mean, fight in the helping out sense, legislation, social progress, those kind of things. And so, are you somebody who's willing to sacrifice what you have to try and help those who do not have? Is kind of the whole thing behind John Brown. So I'd invite you to kind of look up John Brown, research him. He's a really, really, really controversial figure, depending on who you're talking to. I have great respect for somebody who's willing to give up their life for a cause that isn't even connected to their own livelihood or their own success. And that's generally who he was. And those who say killing is never okay don't understand what the institution of slavery was. The institution of slavery, as we talked about in episode 7, A, B, and C, was dying a slow death every single day, and your child dying that slow death every single day for generation and generation and generation and generation. So think about that. Research a little bit more about John Brown, and think about what you can do to leave your own existence and begin to advocate for others around you, particularly in this sense for Black America that has been struggling for several centuries. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon.